I get started. Okay, welcome everyone to the NDAC webinar series. I'm Amy Peacock. I'm a researcher at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, and I'm going to be the chair of your webinar today. Before we start, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, which in my case is the Mwinia people. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that same respect to any First Nations people joining us today. Today we're in for a very exciting presentation, as I'm sure you can see from the slide that is being displayed on the screen. Today we're going to be hearing about the wind of change, alcohol, media and emerging technology. To present this fantastic webinar, we have Dr. Ben Riordan. So Dr. Riordan is an ARC DECRA Research Fellow at the Trobe University's Centre for Alcohol Policy Research. As you might expect, his research focuses on using new and emerging technologies to understand and intervene with people who drink alcohol. We're very privileged today in that we have Professor Emmanuel Kunz joining us as part of the panel discussion at the end of the webinar. Emmanuel is Director of the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research at La Trobe University. He has many research interests, essentially anything to do with alcohol, but in particular relevant to the webinar today, he's interested in alcohol-related cognition, generational transference of alcohol cognitions, and alcohol in the media, and essentially anything to do with alcohol and emerging technologies. We're going to have time at the end for some questions from the audience, so please do send them through. If you can pop them in the Q&A as we listen to the webinar, please don't use the chat, and I'll present them to Emmanuel and Ben at the end of the presentation. As always, we will try our best to get through as many of them as possible, but we may not get through them all, so we'll see how we go. That's enough from me though. I'm really keen to see what these slides look like as we go through. So I might invite Ben to turn on his camera and take it away. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy, and everyone else. So first things first, I do wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land today, so pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So I've titled this talk, The Wind of Change, which I feel like sounds super lovely and aspirational. And while that's kind of what I was going for, this is actually a reference to a German hair metal band, a song by a German hair metal band called the Scorpions that supposedly changed the world. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Scorpions, you can probably be forgiven. Like, they were massive in Europe, not so big here, but they were still like one of the world's largest bands. Like, they've sold over 100 million records. And they're best known for their like weird 80s hair metal sound, their bad boy look, and their like unrelenting like commitment to wearing leather regardless of the climate. Like, these guys are still touring today and they're still rocking the leather like they did in the 80s, which I feel like is solid. Now, unsurprisingly, these guys are a hair metal band from the 80s. They're not known for their lyrical depth. Their lyrics are mainly about like partying and womanizing, and rocking you like a hurricane, right? Like, that is until they released this song, The Wind of Change, which is like a huge deviation from their normal like lyrical focus. This song was about the Soviet Union, and it's characterized by the mood that the Cold War is coming to an end, and that music is this unifying factors between the people. And this really powerful song, which again, lyrically very different to anything they've ever done, was associated with supposedly the collapse of the Soviet governments and the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's like this anthem for change in the East. Now, there is further intrigue to this song, though. Like, there's speculation that the Scorpions didn't write this song, right? It was actually the CIA who actually wrote the song with the band in an attempt to spread it through the Soviet Union to lead to the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And there's a fascinating podcast on this conspiracy theory titled The Wind of Change. And I would highly recommend you check it out because it's super, super fascinating. Now, the reason I've spun this like fairly ridiculous yarn is because media, I think, can be super powerful, right? Like, people believe, like, the reason conspiracy theories like this idea that the CIA writes and weaponizes music is because of this idea that people genuinely believe that music can be powerful, that it can change our behavior and change how we act and lead to the fall of governments. And there's been like a rich history of researchers aiming to look at how music and media can influence our, say, health behaviors and our well-being and how we act. And there's been also a long history of people aiming to look at how like alcohol and other drug representations in the media might, say, influence our own substance use. So, for example, there's a really cool meta-analysis from Curtis et al. That suggested that those who are exposed to more alcohol on social media, so those who see it more or exposed more often, there's a link between that and their own drinking. There's supposedly the link between advertising of alcohol in popular media is supposedly causally linked to alcohol use and the initiation of alcohol use. Like there are recommendations from the World Health Organization to ban advertising to those under 18 because of a lot of this research. And then finally, there are just some really, really cool studies aiming to look at how depictions of alcohol in, say, films and music may influence our own drinking. My favorite of these was actually from Emmanuel's PhD supervisor. And what he did was he created 2 playlists that were sort of matched based on genre and beats per minute, and I think key as well. One was alcohol drenched, like had a lot of alcohol references, and the other had no alcohol references. Well, on nights in a bar, he manipulated which playlist was being played, finding that supposedly on nights where the alcohol-related playlist was played, people spent more money on alcohol. And so I've become like particularly obsessed with this idea of like, well, how are substances depicted in the media? And what is the potential link between, say, exposure and actual alcohol use? And so along with Emmanuel, we've established a new stream of research at CAPR, looking at what I've titled this talk, alcohol, emerging technologies and new media. And I'm going to talk about really 3 of our focuses of that stream of research today. So the first being like, well, how is alcohol actually depicted, or how is alcohol and other substance use depicted in media, and how might we best study that? Secondly, like, what is the actual impact of this exposure, and how on earth do we measure exposure, right? Like, is this actually influential? And more importantly, like, if it is influential, the third point being like, what should we do about it, right? Like, what are the opportunities for policy or intervention? Now, I feel like given that this is a bit of a departure for me, like I really have to justify my move towards this. So the reason I've become particularly obsessed with media and how alcohol is depicted in it is because we're now consuming like more and more diverse media than ever before, right? Thanks to things like Spotify and Netflix and social media, like we have a lot of entertainment and diverse content at our fingertips. Like with Netflix and Spotify, there are hundreds of millions of minutes of content that you can look at and have a run at, which is really exciting and cool, and really exciting and interesting to study. Secondly, like social media as a platform has meant that all of us can have opinions that, say, can go viral or be impactful or that other people can interact with. And it's a fascinating way then for us to actually study, like, how are people talking about alcohol and other drugs and emerging trends or phenomenons online? And I'm particularly interested in that. And then finally, like, thanks to some of our newer methods, like thanks to computing power, but also thanks to advancements in machine learning, we can analyze this data more efficiently and on a larger scale than ever before. So what I mean by this is like previously, you may have to content analyze some media. For example, you pick the top 1,000 songs in the past 10 years on Billboard's Top 100, and you painstakingly read through each of those songs and flag whether alcohol or other drugs was referenced. Well, with machine learning, like we can automate that process a little bit, train an algorithm to run through and flag whether alcohol or other drugs is mentioned. And it means that we don't have to limit ourselves to then those 1,000 songs. We can look at, say, every song in that list from, say, 1965 right up until today. So new methods, I think, in this area mean it's extremely exciting for understanding and studying media. So the first area I want to talk about is alcohol and substances in media. Like, how are these actually discussed online and in different medias? So I'm going to quickly sip my coffee. So I want to touch on social media. For those who don't know, this thing's taken off. Like, there are over 4 billion global social media users. So it's over half the world's population. And we are using this a lot. So an estimated 147 minutes per day, we are spending flicking through, say, pictures of our neighbors' overseas experiences, pictures of cats, and our loving parents' political hot takes, right? Like, we're consuming a lot of information. Now, an estimated 2% of these posts are alcohol related. So given we're dropping 147 minutes per day, it is highly likely that you are seeing alcohol when you jump online and you have a scroll through. And the issue is that the majority of these posts are not necessarily hyping like how bad alcohol is, right? Or how harmful it is, or the fact that it, leads to multiple different cancers. Most of these posts are positive, like they're very pro alcohol or substance use. They're hyping up that alcohol is a sexy, fun, awesome, normal thing to do. And the reason this matters, and I think Emmanuel's going to talk a little bit about this after, is that like there are a lot of theories and rationales as to how exposure to that may actually influence our use. And one thing is by seeing a lot of positive posts that normalize and make it look really cool, it can lead to this, say, norms and expectations, this idea that, hey, if you see a lot of content where alcohol looks awesome, it leads to these ideas and these beliefs that alcohol is normal and awesome and good things happen when you drink, which then in turn supposedly leads to initiation and use. And so Emmanuel and I have run a systematic review in this area, and like largely this is the pathway that there's the most evidence for, that expectancies and norms tend to be like this solid third variable that most of the literature's looked at with some good evidence. And so for our work, I wanted to really look at, well, how are people talking about alcohol and other drugs online? But more importantly, I was interested in how do people talk about negative consequences online? I was really, really interested in how people then talked about alcohol-related blackouts. So for those who are unfamiliar with this, it's a concept. I've chucked a definition on the board. So a blackout is a period of time where an individual has an absence of memory for at least some or part of a drinking session. So this is not to be confused with like passing out, where say someone goes out on the ground, they're sleeping it off, they're not moving around or doing anything, like that's their spot. During a blackout, you can be moving around and interacting and making decisions, but you may, when you wake up, not remember that period of time, right? There's either a blank spot or a very fuzzy bit in your memory. And so my team and I wanted to look at, well, how alcohol-related blackouts are referenced online. We wrote about 6 papers on this. We were interested in lots of different things, but for the purposes of this, let's focus on just how positive or negative these are. So we used Twitter's Firehose to do this back in 2019 when Twitter was still really cool and Elon hadn't ruined it. And so we pulled all of these posts that reference blackout, right? Using the search terms at the top, blackout, blacked out, blackout, blacking out, and blacks out. Because this gets us a lot of random stuff, we then had to sort of train an algorithm to identify what was actually an alcohol-related blackout and what was, say, referencing a power outage or Britney Spears' album. And so trained an algorithm to identify, okay, this is alcohol, this is not. And then finally, we wanted to also then train the algorithm to flag like, what's a positive alcohol-related blackout post and what's a negative? So we could get an estimate of how blackouts were being talked about. To give you an example of this, a negative post would say be referencing this idea that the blackout is very bad. Like it was not a fun experience. You want to change your drinking because of it. You're very embarrassed, or it was say associated with a number of other consequences, like embarrassment or hurting yourself. So here is a sort of standard example from this. Got blackout drunk after my induct talk in front of my boss, Emmanuel. I told him about my idea for using CAPR's back paddock to breed miniature horses instead of applying for grants. I'm so embarrassed. So here, even though this might be like a rock solid business model and something that could be done instead of applying for grants to raise money for our research, it's negative because, I feel embarrassed, or the person who wrote it feels embarrassed. In contrast, a positive would be, say, referencing an intention to black out, that the blackout was associated with positive outcomes, like it was really social, it was fun, it was totally worth it. So here's an example of a positive blackout. Got blackout drunk with my boss after my induct talk. What a great night. I don't remember much, but he seems super keen to buy into my Shetland pony breeding business. So again, like same rock solid business model, but this time, like it's associated with positive outcomes. It was a great night. It was a lot of fun, even though I don't remember very much. So noting that alcohol-related blackouts are seen by researchers like us as a negative consequence, something that is bad and that happens after you've drunk too much. Noting that we screen for this in the audit, right? Like the tool we recommend to screen for alcohol use, we have an item on memory loss. And noting that like it's a pretty good predictor of subsequent alcohol use or substance use disorder. How were these talked about online? Well, like 73% of these posts were positive, right? They were pro-alcohol and hyping up that blackouts were the intention or were fun or were totally worth it. So that was I should note, like initially, I don't think this was the point of this project. We wanted to see if we could identify blackouts and then potentially offer someone an intervention. Instead, what we found was like, well, most of the posts about alcohol-related harms online are minimizing those harms and focusing on how actually good. We looked to see if there were like transitions or changes in this over time, finding largely, no, they're all like relatively positive, slightly more positive during weekends and events, but not really that much difference. Now, it's not just alcohol where this is the case. We found this in other drugs as well. So, for example, when we looked at cannabis and every alcohol-related, every cannabis-related tweet written in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we found again, like when we ripped 304,760 cannabis-related tweets, 62% of these were positive, right? They highlighted that cannabis was fun and awesome, and minimize some of the harms. There were some that were neutral in this case and a minority that were negative. And it's not just, the cool thing about, I think, social media is like, it's not just looking at the sentiment of how these drugs are talked about online to say, understand again, what impact they may have on use. But we can actually use these posts to look at, well, how are people talking about emerging phenomenons, or even alcohol or other drug policy, for us nerds who are interested in that. And so for this project in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I wasn't just interested in like how people talked about cannabis. Well, this project was actually in the build up to New Zealand's cannabis referendum. And so I was really, really interested in like, well, how are people talking about this referendum online as we build up to it? So looking at like, what were the sticking points for people? Like what parts did they think were important or not important? Or what were their reasons for voting no or yes? And we could sort of monitor this, which was really cool in real time. And we actually reported this back using a Shiny app to New Zealand as well, like keeping this updated daily so people could see like the swings in sentiment as we approached the election, which was super cool. And we aim to use it as a tool to engage people to help enroll them to vote and to provide them with some information about the cannabis referendum. What we found was somewhat interesting. Like we didn't see a big pickup in chatter until really right before the election. Part of this may have been that this was a COVID election, so like there were other stories dominating the news feed. But as we approached, we did start seeing a massive increase in the chatter. And interestingly, like particularly the pro legalization votes, which really started to see a big uptick as we approached the election. The cool thing about this, I think, was we could see these sentiment shifts over time as things happen. So like as ex-Prime Minister John Key came out against the Vote Yes campaign, like you saw it tick down a bit. As the New Zealand Medical Association pulled support from the Vote No campaign, like it also came down, or like positive sentiment came up. So it was a really fascinating way to look at like what chatter was dominating the news fair and also like what misinformation was creeping in. We did not obviously manage to predict the outcome of this election using Twitter chatter. So 41% of these posts were sort of pro, versus 24% that were anti the cannabis referendum. But yeah, obviously this did not get up. So alone, social media use is probably not going to predict the outcome. But I still think it can be used as an adjunct, like or combined with, say, surveys as well as interviews. We've used this for other stuff as well, like how people talk on social media about health guidelines, for example. So when Australia released their new alcohol drinking guidelines, we had a look at how people were talking about it online to look at like what misinformation is creeping in or how are people understanding this or which of the guidelines are they actually talking about. And so I think it's really valuable for that, right? Like looking where misinformation is creeping in and where you might target your campaign to roll these out or inform people. One great thing is it's really quick to do. So one good thing is like a lot of people were looking at whether alcohol had increased post-COVID. Well, we were already monitoring the chatter on Twitter, looking at how many alcohol-related blackouts were referenced to see whether, okay, are we seeing a spike in alcohol-related chatter online? Finding that not really. Like people are spending more time online. They are posting more about alcohol, but they're posting more about everything. So we didn't see a disproportionate increase in alcohol-related posts. We also used it to track actually, well, how are bottle shops chatting about alcohol during that COVID election? And so we could do some, the COVID period. So we could do some really cool stuff here. Finally, I think as social media and learning about stuff is using social media to learn about things is also great for particularly stigmatized behaviors, like drink spiking or pregnancy. So we're using Reddit where users can remain anonymous to track how they're actually chatting about these things, which I think is super, super cool. So there's lots of work you can do for looking at how alcohol and other drugs are talked about in the media, particularly policies, that I think is super fascinating. I think the next point to pivot to then is like, well, what's the impact, right? Like, who actually cares if most of these posts are positive? Like, what does that actually mean for our alcohol use? And again, like, I'll redirect you back to this model again, saying that, like, hey, exposure to these positive posts tends to say lead to an increase in expectancies and norms, which then in turn leads to use, right? Seeing positive stuff leads to this belief that it's positive, which then leads to use. The problem with a lot of this research, or some of this research in this area, as we've started getting into it, is that it's really, really hard to measure exposure, right? Like, and I think, like, from our review, we noticed that as well. It's like, how do you measure exposure and do it accurately? And it turns out that relying on self-report is really hard. So I want to illustrate this by us all doing a very, very fun experiment. And so this is a study we ran. I want you, if you have anything in front of you, that's going to be helpful. But you'll have pretty good memories, so you can think about these answers in your head, or even just remember them in your heart, like feel the answer. All right, so I'm going to run through 3 very popular films. I want you to estimate how many times you see alcohol in these films. And I'm hoping, like, you've seen the film, but it probably actually doesn't matter if you've seen the film or not. Like, use your best guess and you'll probably be just as accurate. All right, so how many times do you think alcohol is seen in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban? So for those who are unfamiliar, this is the 3rd Harry Potter film. It's an absolute banger, probably the best of the books and about mid-ranked in terms of the movies. But it's a film about kids in a high school. So how many times do you think we see alcohol in that? Next is Ratatouille, a heartwarming tale about a rat who just wants to cook. So he breaks into a kitchen and co-ops a human's body to help him cook for him. How many times do you think Ratatouille shows alcohol? And again, like, write it down, think it in your head, or like feel the answer in your heart. And then finally, probably the best of this list, Cars 3, an absolute banger of a flick. The return of Lightning McQueen, as he struggles with the twilight of his career, starting to become not the number 1 anymore and pivoting to a more mentoring role with Cruz Ramirez. I have seen this film far too many times, and so I could give an entire talk just on Cars 3. But how many times do you think alcohol was seen in this absolute epic? All right, so let's just quickly run through the results. I'm hoping you've got your answers in front of you. So Harry Potter, again, shot in a school, had 22 times alcohol is shown. Ratatouille has a whopping 60, probably because it's set in a kitchen, but alcohol is shown a lot in the film Ratatouille. And then finally, Cars, I really threw in there as a bit of a wild card. That has 0. That's a film about cars. I will note, though, that this film actually does have a lot of weird references to alcohol. Like, the cars are sitting in a bar drinking oil. And so if you put a couple for this, I'm going to give it to you, but it sits around 0. So I'm going to say I can't see your answers. I don't know if anyone's put it in the chat. I can't see your chat, so I don't know if you got this right. But I'm going to say you underestimated the amount of alcohol in these films. Like, this is a pretty reliable thing. Like, it was highly likely that you were wrong. I didn't even pick wild ones, apart from, I guess, Ratatouille is very high, but it's highly likely you underestimated just how much alcohol was in these films. And we did this study with about 700 Australians. We presented them with a list of 107 films and we asked them to select up to 10 of the films that they remembered best or had seen recently or knew a lot about. We then asked them how long ago they'd seen them, and then asked them to indicate, okay, how much alcohol is in this film, or do you remember seeing in this film? And we wanted to check, like, okay, how accurate are people at this? And then importantly, like, who actually might underestimate it? Well, we thought maybe people who drank more might be better at it because alcohol is very salient and might be more memorable. But what we really found was, so overall, people suggested there were 9 alcohol references or depictions in the films that they selected. In reality, there were 45. So they massively underestimated the amount of alcohol in these films. Largely, they were not even close. Most people were not even within touching distance of the answer in any of these cases. We found that demographic variables did not matter. It didn't matter if your gender or sex or your age or how much alcohol you consumed. Everyone was bad at this. The only predictor of accuracy was really like whether it was G, PG, or M. And that's because there was slightly less alcohol in those films, right? Like, films like Cars have 0, and people tended to be better at estimating those, not because they were more right, but because there was just less alcohol in those films to underestimate. Now, like a clear limitation of this film is the fact of the study is the fact that we asked people, and they maybe haven't seen these films for a while. Like, even though we asked them for the films they remembered best, and we picked some absolute banger films that we knew people would have seen, they still may not have seen them for a while. So we've replicated this and actually showed people tourism ads. This was the Where the Bloody Hell Are You study. This was a very popular ad in New Zealand. I don't know if you guys are going to get this reference. Like, do they show Australian tourism ads in Australia? We'll never know. So we showed people a compilation of some of these tourism ads for about 10 minutes. And it included 12 depictions of alcohol in them. One of them was pretty memorable. It was of a pilot opening a beer and handing it to someone. So like, there's some stuff in there that we thought was pretty memorable. And again, we asked people like, hey, that film you just watched, how much alcohol did you see in it? And again, we found that people drastically underestimated, suggesting there were 6 when actually there were 12. And we found no demographic variables predicted that underestimation. So this somewhat concerned us is like, well, how good then are we at actually estimating how much alcohol we might see in the media? And our thought is we might be really, really bad at this. And it's not just this, like there was a really, really great study looking at overall media use, like how good are you at estimating how much time you spend on social media? Because a really popular way of measuring that is to ask people, hey, Amy, how long did you spend on social media today? And that study then took the true logged values, which they got off their phone, and found, again, people are terrible at this. Like they're not even close at estimating how much time they spend engaging with media. And it seems that, again, like we're very bad at estimating how much alcohol we're exposed to. And there are probably some reasons for this. Like alcohol is so normal and everywhere it's, you just forget it. It's just so normative that it's not salient at all. And thus, why would we remember it? Now, one positive I should say is like not every study has used self-report to measure this, right? There are some really, really cool examples of people using creative measures to actually measure exposure. One of my favorites is with films. So this study, like studies have used what I think is called the Beach model, where similar to what we did, they present a list of 100 films that they've, say, content coded and ask people which of them they've seen, and they can estimate how much alcohol people have seen based on the films they've selected. Recently, people have been doing, say, scroll through interviews where you sit opposite someone and interview them as they scroll through their social media feed, and you can estimate how much alcohol and the type of alcohol people see there. More recently, like screen recording or screenshots have come in. So the Stanford Screennomics project, where they take a screenshot every, say, 4 seconds on a phone. And then again, you use like machine learning techniques to estimate just how much alcohol or whatever people are exposed to. So there are some really good examples of people getting around this idea that we're bad at self-report. But yeah, self-report alone may not be the best way to measure this. So my entire DECRA is dedicated to like, how can we best measure exposure and better measure this link between exposure and use? Another way to do this, and this is like shamefully pivoting to my own study, is to do this experimentally. So the study I talked about at the start from Emmanuel's PhD supervisor, where he randomized people into, he randomized playlists. So you either heard a very alcohol-related one or not. We did something similar, looking at mental health or stigma against those with mental illness. And so we ran an experimental study at the time that this very large flick, The Joker, was released. So for those who don't know this film Joker, I think it was released pre-COVID, back when we used to go to the cinemas. And it was a massive hit, like grossed over $1 billion at the box office. I think at the time it was the largest superhero film. And it tells the origin story of the Joker. So in this film, Arthur, who becomes the Joker, is depicted as having a mental illness. He visits Arkham State Hospital to receive medication and frequently displays symptoms that suggest some form of serious mental illness. And because of budget cuts, unfortunately, in the film, Arthur stops receiving his medication and then proceeds to carry out and go on a campaign of violence that includes murder, right? So it's this depiction of someone who has mental illness and then becomes extremely violent and unpredictable. And we wanted to see, well, like, what is the impact of exposure to this type of media on your beliefs and perceptions of others with mental illness? And so Damien Scarf ran this at the University of Otago. It's just a very cool study. He pulled people in to the cinemas, and randomized them to either go watch The Joker or go watch another film that was popular at the time that was also an action film. The film Terminator Judgment Day, which is very much like a bang bang shoot 'em up us versus the robots film, like an AI uprising, a lot like today. But it's a film that was matched because there's no mental health stigma in this film. It's pretty straight up and down. It's us versus the robots. And so people will randomize those two films. Before the films, they filled out a questionnaire to ask about prejudice against those with mental illness. Items like people with mental illness often do unexpected things, or I'm not scared of people with mental illness, or people who become mentally ill are not failures in life. So items like that, right? Like, are people with mental illness unpredictable? And what we found asking those surveys pre and post the film is that those who saw The Joker, this depiction of mental illness or someone who's unpredictable, they tended to increase their prejudice post, right? In contrast, the shoot 'em up bad guy film, we found no difference. So experimental studies are a really, really cool way of doing this. While they may show, though, like the short-term effects, like it's harder to do this over a really long period of time. So studies have tried to do this with social media, where they ask people to take social media breaks, but it's really difficult for us to say, like, hey, or to pump a lot of alcohol-related content into people's real life. So these types of studies are great for like a single session, like the barroom study, which I think is really cool, where they played those different playlists. All right, so then the final talk that I want to chat about is what do we do about this, right? Like, what can we do with policy and intervention in this space? And so we've been running some studies to have a look at this. One thing we've done with people is can we get people to be more supportive of policy by telling them how bad they are at estimating how much alcohol is in films, by telling people just how much alcohol is in these popular films, particularly those aimed at kids, and the potential impacts of them. So in that study where we asked people to select the top 10 films and estimate how much alcohol they saw, we also randomized people to receive some education or some feedback. So we essentially reported like, hey, you just estimated films. You underestimated how much alcohol is in those films. For example, there's 22 scenes of alcohol in Harry Potter, 60 depictions of alcohol in Ratatouille. We then told them, like, research suggests there's a clear link between exposure and use, and there's a really high number of alcohol events, even in kids' films. After we randomized them into either that feedback condition or like an attention-matched control, where I think they just listed their favorite film, we then asked them a range of policy options and their support. So things like, how much do you agree with the following? The amount of alcohol shown should be included in the classification or rating system that rates alcohol. Children under 15 should not be shown alcohol. Films should not glorify alcohol, or that educational messages should be provided before or after films that include alcohol. So we had 8 statements kind of like that, some focusing on education, some focusing on kids, some focusing on like industry sponsorship. And what did we find? So our aim was, if we provide people with this feedback and we tell them how bad they are and just how much alcohol is in these, will they be more supportive of these policies? And the answer was no. Overall, it did not really change how they viewed or how supportive they were of these policies, which was a little disappointing. Overall, though, people were more in favor of certain policies than we thought, which is really cool. Next, we thought, all right, well, what about some education? So this was, again, a study from Damien Scarf, and one of the reasons I mentioned The Joker is because I wanted to mention this study. So after they watched The Joker, what if we provide some post-film education, right? For example, we include statements like this: 90 to 95% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder do not commit any violent crimes, right? Like, they're more likely to be the victim of a violent crime than to perpetrate one. What do we see if we provide those types of educational messages at the end of the film? Would we still see that increase in mental health stigma? And so Damien and friends randomized people again into 2 Joker conditions. Both conditions watched the film. One had post-film education. And overall, both conditions saw an increase in stigma against mental illness. So this type of post-seeing of education did not seem to have any impact, at least in this study. I think others have had better impact. So yeah, that's somewhat depressing. The other thing we're trying to do is, this is some ongoing work with some of my US collaborators, and is funded by an AAA grant. We wanted to see, in that blackout study, well, if people have referenced a really negative event, or if they've referenced something that might indicate that they would be a good candidate for an intervention, can we reach out to them on social media and provide them with some information or a social normative based feedback intervention? What should that intervention look like? What should the message look like? Can we feasibly do it? Or is it weird if we pop up in your inbox with this information? And so Jen, Meryl, and Rosemary Ward are leading this in the US. And we're running interviews and surveys with non-college young adults to look at, like, can we do this, right? There's a great group, I think, from Aotearoa New Zealand called Live for Tomorrow, who's doing this with crisis-related posts at the moment. So people who write tweets or publicly available posts that about being in crisis, they reach out to them on the platform and offer some support. Like, they're a proactive help group. Can we take an approach that's similar to that with, say, alcohol use online? And so that's an ongoing study, but I'm excited about the idea of, seeing if we can be proactive. Some of that work becomes really hard when we've, as I mentioned, written a lot of studies on Twitter and gotten really good at that. And now I don't think we can do this on Twitter anymore. And so there are some challenges to that, but I'm really excited about the potential for that. Like, can we reach out to people online? So that's largely what we're doing in that space. There's a little bit more as well, but I should finish off so we can have some questions and stuff. So our next steps in general is, like, we want to continue refining that monitoring, like to look at how people are talking about alcohol and other drugs. Emmanuel and I have some cool projects with music and films, as well as like tracking social media use and how people are talking about certain behaviors and policies online. We also want to nail our methods for exposure. Like, how can we best measure this and get really good data to better look at that link between, say, exposure and use, and also provide some really good evidence for some of the theories understanding that link. And I think Emmanuel's going to talk about those theories soon. And then finally, to continue to look for avenues like what are our best buys in terms of interventions and policy, and what can we actually do? So I have to say a huge thanks to lots of people who have worked on these projects. The people in yellow there have been like my mentors for the projects and are my mentors on the DECRA. Also a huge thanks to everyone who funded this type of work. And then, yeah, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Round of applause for Ben. Sorry, it's a bit weird on webinars. You can't hear the applause, but there's applause happening, Ben. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think, so we've got podcast recommendations, film recommendations, song recommendations. I think there's already a song request in the Q&A section. Maybe you could sing if we get enough time.
I did think about singing one of the songs, but their lyrics are so bad that I thought it's 2023.
Yeah. But I would encourage I would encourage everyone to put questions in the Q&A. I mean, you are one of my favorite academic storytellers. I think that's the only way to describe you, Ben. You just brilliant presentation, but not just the presentation, the work. It's so interesting, it's so unique, and I think it's just grappling with that question of how do we counter that, I guess, undue influence of the content that's put across in media. There's two things that really stood out to me. One is you made that comment, it was just a brief comment about how do we bring these data in alongside other data for monitoring purposes, and that's really of interest to me. But the other thing I was thinking about was tobacco, as well as we were going through this. Like, there's been such a big shift for tobacco, and I wonder what we can learn there too. But this isn't my question time, it's everyone else's. Emmanuel, can I ask you a minute or two, immediate thoughts, reflections on Ben's talk? What should we take away from this?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Well, first of all, it's always a privilege to hear Ben talk, and I never get bored of that. He's such a good presenter, and yeah, thanks to him a lot. What I would like to highlight is, and Ben touched on that, but still to stress it once more, exposure matters. What we see, we act upon. And we did a lot of research actually on little kids to see what they know. And kids as young as age 4 to 5, they know already a lot about alcohol exposure, social learning theory. They pick that up. They know about norms, about expectancies, and so on. And we also ask them where they get that knowledge from. And it's not only the parents, it's if the grandparents and friends of the parents come over and the kids see them drinking, or if the parents take them to festivals and fairs and so on, and kids pick that up. So when kids are exposed to alcohol content and they see drinking, they learn about that. But then exposure also matters for drinkers. There's a lot of research on implicit cognitions of adults, and just one study I was involved in the Netherlands, we were showing young adults films, and the cover story was whether you would understand the English films with and without subtitles, but that was irrelevant to our purpose. We said, well, there is a fridge, just grab whatever you like to drink and watch the film, and you will fill in a questionnaire afterwards. And in the late afternoon, most of the adults, they picked alcoholic beverages and then started to drink in synchronicity with the actors on the screen. So whenever the actor took a sip, our participants took a sip. And you may know the yawning effect. So someone starts to yawn and you yawn as well. Well, the same apparently is true for alcohol, and that was replicated with Confederates and other studies multiple times. So a lot of things trigger our behavior, in this case, alcohol consumption, without our awareness when we are a frequent drinker. And that comes back to exposure. So why exposure is so important? Because it influences our behavior without even be aware of it. Now, what is less known? So the effects are known, but what is less known is actually how often does it occur? We are all flooded with media exposure in films and social media and so on. We are so often online. The question is how often we are confronted, and also who sees more alcohol. What, if you listen to the Rolling Stones, do you hear more alcohol than if you listen to Tupac Shakur or whoever? So all these are thrilling questions that we would like to answer in the coming years. But then moving on to, and Ben touched on that, if we know how important exposure is, and if we know how often people are exposed, what do we do with that? And that's really challenging, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to that. But we could do information, we could, put more awareness, and I think we should make people more aware. This is not an ordinary commodity. What you see, you act upon, and you are not even aware of it. So please be better aware of it. And what can we do to make people better aware, despite the depressing evidence that Ben showed, that actually making people aware do not really change their behavior apparently. But we will investigate more on that. The other thing that we were discussing with experts in law is how can we better regulate alcohol in the media? And there are some options, but it's often unpopular, and it's difficult to do also because all the national, international discussion comes in. So a lot of content is not produced in Australia, it's produced internationally, and how to regulate that product that actually comes into or other platforms like Instagram are international. One country cannot easily regulate that. But again, also here we are continuing the discussion with the law people, whether there's any way to regulate it. So these are my 2 cents. I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thanks for that, Emmanuel. And I should say congratulations to you as well for this huge body of work and your involvement as well. It's very impressive. And we've got Ben back, and we have a question. We have questions, and please continue to put them in the chat. So a question from Leon. Sorry if I missed this. Are there regulations around the number of times alcohol is referenced or shown in a movie and the movie age classification? If not, are there proposals to do this? I think Emmanuel, this is kind of alluding to what you talked a bit about before, but Ben, do you want to kick off?
Emmanuel has just finished an editorial on this that I just sent back to him. So I do not want to steal Emmanuel's thunder here. Emmanuel, do you want to touch on this?
Well, there is a classification system to inform people about the content. But the problem is alcohol is not part of that, not explicitly part of that. It's modeled in a category with other themes of violence and so on. So we would argue for having better information on films, but that concerns films that are released. The big problem is, we also see alcohol in a lot of other spaces. For example, when it comes to sports, go to any sport event, AFL, or I had been to tennis recently, Australian Open, for the first time in my life, and was blown away. Also, the kind of alcohol that you see there is impressive. No beer, there's more gin tonic and champagne and this kind of stuff. But yeah, how to regulate that? This is a big question.
I mean, it was successful with the tobacco, right? Wasn't there like an agreement that reduced the amount? So going back to your point earlier, Amy, there's a great paper, I think, that actually studied both alcohol and nicotine exposure. And there was a drop-off in nicotine exposure. And I think at the same time, the alcohol industry was like, yes, we should definitely do something about alcohol too, but we haven't seen that similar drop. So yeah, I think, Emmanuel, what are the current laws? It's like it shouldn't glorify or show that alcohol leads to positive outcomes, but apparently that's not really well enforced or understood. Is that right, Emmanuel?
Well, there's a difference between alcohol exposure and alcohol marketing, which are two different things. And the big question is, how should we regulate one or the other? I think we did a survey among participants, what Ben was briefly talking about, and asked them 12 different policy options. Are you in favor of that? And interestingly, feeding back the amount of alcohol they see did not really change it. However, anyone was in favor of being better informed when they see films. But when it comes to real regulations, we should forbid something, then participants were less open to that possibility.
I mean, they were, I think, from memory, more positive towards those with like recommendations for children, like reducing violence to children. And we ran some interviews with, say, 25 Australian drinkers and asked, or people who drank, and asked about like, what are some individual things we could do? And they're like, shouldn't the government be doing stuff about this? So like they did seem like, yeah, like they also think there's a lot of exposure and we should be doing more stuff in that area. So like, I think, as Emmanuel said, like people were relatively positive towards those changes.
And I guess with the shifts in, the shifts in consumption among ignore the fly. The shifts in consumption among young people that we're seeing as well, in more recent birth cohorts, like maybe we'll get more support as that generation comes through. I'm keen to see.
With an aging population as well, right? Like, people being more.
Sorry.
Good.
Distracted butterfly. So I want to follow up on something else. So why no impact of education? Like, it seems like you really hope that would happen. Why not? Any thoughts?
Well, one thing to mention is our interventions are really minimal, right? We were just feeding back how much alcohol you see. That is probably not enough to nudge people. Also, we just mentioned tobacco and the shift that tobacco has undergone in the last decade. But I think the regulation was just following up on the public opinion, not the other way around. It's not that you can introduce regulations and the public opinion would not support it. And also that, tobacco consumption was very severely harmful. We know that since the 60s. And it's still, 30 years had to go by of piling evidence, of convincing people, always showing the same harmful effects. And then after a while, public opinion shifted. So we can be hopeful, with the lower trends among young people, but they seem to catch up as well as they grow older. Some would not be so optimistic about that, but I'm still hopeful, that slowly with evidence piling up, especially when it comes to cancer or injuries, that slowly the public opinion will shift as well, and then we were more open to see these effects.
I mean, we could have included more personalized feedback as well. Like, really tried to include more. Like, it was static. It was really short. With Damien's, I think he toyed around with the idea of actually having a recording of someone like with bipolar or schizophrenia, like saying, "Hi, I'm this person and I don't violently kill people." Or just saying like, this was a fun movie, but not an accurate depiction. But I think the problem is with an hour and 45 minutes of like being saturated in like a 20-second thing, it's a lot to undo,
Yeah. Yeah. And Leon is coming through with the great questions, and I think is somewhat related to what we're just talking about. So Leon has asked, in your research, have you examined how the trustworthiness or expertise of the source of information influences how much it changes people's opinions? I'm wondering if the trustworthiness can be enhanced. That might help. I'm thinking we're talking specifically around the
I see
education.
the feedback. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really good point. I mean, for ours, I would have hoped like it was very Trobe. You know, it's a university and this is a legitimate source. And the Otago study, you know, as well, as run through a university, which is trusted, but maybe, you know, we could do more there. And like, I think personalizing a little bit more and doing what we can there. I don't know. I haven't, like, some people have seen some more positive effects of education. It's just in ours, maybe we haven't done a good enough job of that yet.
One interesting thing in that respect is also, you know, is it the case that people don't see it, but the question is, do they don't look, or do they look and forget? So is it so normal that it does not stick in memory, or is it so normal that you don't see it in the first place? So there's also something we may investigate in the future to better leverage that for education.
Yeah, and I think Ben, you should probably be in contact with Leon as a potential collaborator, because Leon has just come through, and no, Leon, you're not hogging the questions, has suggested that maybe if we have more engaging ways to counter misinformation that fits with the way media is consumed these days. So a bit more trustworthiness, as you say, personalized, matches how people are consuming, maybe that will help.
Yeah, I would be keen to try and see if we could feed back more stuff and make it more interesting and engaging. Like, and like the other thing that one of the reviewers suggested in the paper was like, you ran this during COVID and people were so over health messaging at this point that maybe it was just like, oh, please no more. So I don't know whether I buy that, is it? But yeah, Leon, get in touch. Let's see what we can do.
Well,
you, Emmanuel, sorry.
Just one thought. One big problem is, of course, that we move more and more towards a society of entertainment. Everything should be fun and quick and easy digestible, and life is hard enough, you know, don't bother, just you know, be entertained whatever it costs. And I think that's not the right way. You know, we are arguing for be mindful, do the right choices. This is harmful. This is actually not. Ben presented that blackouts, right? Blackout was fun. You know, don't ruin my fun. Well, it's not all fun at the end of the day, right?
So no Shetland ponies at CAPR anytime soon, Emmanuel.
Look, this is the second talk in a week that I've given in front of Emmanuel, and I'm really pushing for the Shetland pony thing.
Yeah,
like,
I think
I'm going to start working this into everything now. Like,
I think so. Build your case. It's great. And I want to, Emmanuel, what you were just saying then. So Bridget has just said, has a study been done on alcohol coverage on Melbourne Cup Day? A lot of that is depicted as, oops, that woman fell in a bush. How fun. I think there's a bit of a mixture in the reporting on that. Some of it's kind of like, how embarrassing for them. You like, look at all these shameful things that are being done. Like it's interesting, isn't it? That do we think, I guess, where are we going? Well, firstly, answer Bridget's question. Has there been a study around that? But I guess, yeah, how can we use this reporting to maybe show the harms of alcohol use as well?
Well, and how can we remind people that harm is not fun? You know, that some things are not entertaining. Although we live in such a society that everything has to. Ben did research or we did research on how often alcohol is depicted in Instagram in a negative way, showing the downsides of alcohol. And the result is simply zero. There is zero representation of negative events. And that comes back to that this is a platform for entertainment, and we have to be entertained around the clock. And even if something's harmful, then still there is an entertaining effect to that. Yeah, I know that's not a good answer, but yeah.
I don't know any specific Melbourne Cup stuff. So that US blackout stuff I ran with Jen Merrill and Rosemary Ward. We're really interested in how people chatted about this for specific events. Like one of our studies was like, surely like maybe these are more positive during these big events where alcohol and really heavy use is more normalized. And we did find like, yeah, there were certain events where we saw more, but there wasn't a huge difference in like the percentage that were positive. Like it seemed like that didn't shift. And I don't know whether that would be the same for the Melbourne Cup. I would say you'd probably see an increase in posts, right? Like we should check that influencer data set, Emmanuel, look at like, all right, what events are we seeing all these posts? But yeah, it's a fascinating one. We didn't see much shift for sentiment, at least on Twitter, and I mean on Instagram they're all positive anyway. So there's nothing. Yeah, but good question. That's cool.
Yeah. So I think we are 2 minutes to 4. There's a few other questions here. One around how do you track social media? And maybe we can link to some of your papers, Ben, to give a bit more of an explanation around that, and references for the content. So similarly, we might link to some of your papers, but there's a whole heap of praise in the chat. So I just want to say, and clearly the flyer that's in the room was really excited by your presentation as well, because it keeps coming back. But I just want to say thank you so much, Ben, for the time. We really appreciate you presenting to us such interesting work, such great presentation as always. Emmanuel, delightful to have you here as well and to hear from your expertise too. We are and thank you everyone for listening in. Before you escape, I think we're going to tell you about what is coming next. So we're just going to pop up a slide to tell you about some of the exciting things that are coming. So one of those things is the NDAC Symposium, which is being held at the end of October in Sydney. You can register online, you can attend in person, or you can listen in virtually. We also have a number of webinars coming up, which I don't have on the top of my head, but we will share with you when we send the feedback forms around. Oh, here we go. There we go. So we also have unlocking opportunities to integrate smoking cessation in lung cancer screening, insights from expert stakeholders, and that's on Thursday, the 19th of October. As I said, please do register for the NDAC Annual Research Symposium. And hey, if Ben's work has inspired you and you're thinking about doing a PhD at some point, we have PhD scholarships open at the moment at NDAC. So check out the website to find out more information about how you can apply and what cool research you could be doing. Again, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much, Ben and Emmanuel. It was fantastic. And I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.
Thanks.